Hello, everyone. This is Kristen Conrad, and today we are going over 5 articles in the Gloria Ladson-Billings Reader, which are toward a critical race theory of education. Yes, but how do we do it? Liberatory consequences of literacy, a case of culturally relevant instruction for African American students, pushing past the achievement gap, an essay on the language of deficit, and finally, silences as weapons, challenges of a Black professor teaching white students. Next, let's learn a little bit about Dr. Gloria Lansing-Billings. She is a researcher, scholar, and educator. She is known for her breakthrough research on culturally relevant pedagogy. She is also a former Kellner Family Distinguished Professor of Urban Education in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction and a faculty affiliate in their Department of Educational Policy Studies at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. While she serves as the president of the National Academy of Education, she continues to write research articles, publish books, and travel to different colleges of education to give lectures on culturally relevant pedagogy. Now let's define culturally relevant pedagogy. CRP is a theoretical teaching method that focuses on students' academic success while supporting and reaffirming their cultural identities. Esquardo states there are 3 fundamental pillars: academic achievement, cultural competence, and social political consciousness. All 3 must be practiced at the same time in order to challenge educational inequalities. Our first article is toward a critical race theory of education. I embedded the entire article within this slide, and this article sets forth 3 propositions on the causes of social and educational inequity. The first concept states that race still plays a significant role in inequity in all aspects of life in the United States, and this is supported by statistical and demographic research on student dropouts, suspension rates, and incarceration rates. The second concept states that society is based on property rights within the United States. And this information is confirmed because funds for education diverge drastically between white and predominantly Black communities. The third concept states that we use the first 2 concepts to better understand why a critical race theoretic approach in education is needed. This article wraps up by reminding educators that multicultural education is not the same concept as critical race theory. While multicultural education tries to keep this status quo, critical race theory challenges the system of institutional racism. Okay, let me highlight this real quick so you can see it. I really enjoyed this article, and I agree with the research presented in this article, especially around the information about property rights. It was very interesting to learn about the law students in the 1970s who discovered and discussed they were being overlooked in critical legal studies. And this is just another instance of institutional racism. This form of racism aimed to keep Black people in certain areas together by denying them property and barring them from legal protection if they were unfairly denied property. The other theorems in the article quite plainly spell out that you cannot bring about change without challenging institutions that continue to fail Black people and other people of color. So this was a great article about critical race theory, and I learned a lot of new important information. And on to my goals. The article made me realize that you can't regulate learning about diversity to a holiday or just a day. CRT is a subject that needs to be instilled throughout my curriculum, and it has to span multiple content areas. This is important because it allows my students to make connections with what they are already learning. In the future, I am hoping that I can not only create a classroom that celebrates the whole child, but I also hope that I can become involved in changing policies that are detrimental to students of colors in my school and community. And on to our next article. Yes, but how do we do it? And here's the embedded article. Yes, but how do we do it? Tackles the issues of teachers rejecting culturally relevant teaching because they claim a lack of instruction on how. The article suggests that instead of focusing on what to do, educators should focus on 5 key elements. First, social context, which takes into consideration how students relate to the world around them. Second, students, in which educators regard them as capable and resilient. Third, curriculum, which calls for educators to deconstruct and reconstruct the status quo curriculum into a culturally relevant one. Fourth, instruction, which needs educators to be aware of who they are teaching and to just adjust teaching strategies depending on the students. And fifth, academic achievement, which calls for educators to put academic achievement before trying to fix behavior issues. The article then covers how much, like the medical system, the current educational system only cares about what happens to students while they're under their care. This is due to poor teacher education and understanding of the community they are teaching. Actually really love this article, and I do agree with the research found in it. The points made about how some educators are unwilling to learn were very interesting, and it reminded me of discussions about racism that I've had before, because those people frequently say, well, teach me, or no one has ever taught me. So that was very interesting. And I also really agree that the most important thing to learn about when you're learning to teach is about social political issues that affect your school, the community, and your students. The article concluded with that our role in our students' lives should extend outside the classroom. So the article reminds me that I must not only think about my students in the context of the school, but I must understand them in the context of how they fit into their community. So I hope that one day that I could also do social work, because I feel that is very important to the field of education as well. And I feel that it will help me run a more diverse classroom. And on to the next article, Liberatory Consequences of Literacy, a Case of Culturally Relevant Instruction for African American Students. This article begins by explaining the history of the African American diaspora. The article states that while there are disagreements between Africans and African Americans about cultural continuity, this shared connection and consciousness can be used as a basis for understanding how to use literacy as a tool of liberation. The article later argues that literacy techniques should include verbal and visual literature that is both meaningful and useful for African American students. And finally, the article follows an educator that exemplifies what culturally relevant approaches to teaching looks like. In the end, we learn that the most important factor of culturally relevant instruction is learning the survival strategies and history of African Americans so educators can better arm African American students with accurate historical and social information. This was a great article that I do agree with. I especially like the idea of finding ways outside of regular print to help reach African American students. I agree with the information presented on how education is often alienating for African American children. And this ties into the literary component of this article, because for a lot of people of color, they don't see themselves or their cultures represented in these books. When they are present, they are often represented inaccurately. Ladson-Billings states, the essential elements of such teachings involves developing concepts of self and others. I recently did some volunteer work for a class, and I realized how out of touch I was with my own community. I will definitely use the information from this article to not only learn about what is truly affecting my students and community, but also to physically go out and try to help my community more. I hope in the future this will allow me to learn and teach with a little bit more understanding and compassion. And on to the next article, Pushing Past the Achievement Gap, an essay on the language of deficit. This article takes the focus off of the word achievement gap and instead refocuses on what causes the achievement gap. This article discusses how wealth, health, and funding issues are actually the cause of academic failure in many children of color. The second half of the article discusses the language and attitude towards parents who seem like they don't care. We learned that many families are facing hardships such as language barriers, food, home, and job security, as well as time constraints. The article ends with imploring educators to change the deficit language used against their students and instead focus on ways to pay down the education debt. This article was one of my favorites because it focused on the language used towards students. I grew up with an immigrant mother who didn't speak English and a busy military father, so I have heard a lot of that type of language before. As a parent, I have also heard that language used towards me as well, mostly because I found it really difficult to meet these teachers on their terms alone. I really agree with the article's conclusion that we really need to change the discourse around the achievement gap. The article mentions that we often place the blame on students for their failures instead of recognizing that the educational system fails them instead. Article, there was a discussion on how many students live outside their school districts and their parents did not have the transportation means to make it to their school conferences and events. So this makes me very interested in putting together a packet of free information about free school, county, and state programs that are available for all students at the beginning of the school year. I also love the idea of creating something like a classroom blog where parents who may be a little shy could find information there without directly contacting me. And last but not least, silences as weapons, challenges of a Black professor teaching white students. Silences as Weapons, the Challenges of a Black Professor Teaching White Students explores three related but distinct topics. First, there is a discussion about how subjects such as race, gender, and class are perceived differently depending on the ethnicity or race of the person presenting them. The second topic discusses things like fear of being judged, unwillingness to learn or care, which can cause students to silence themselves during discussions about race. The third topic discusses how the educational system often silences students of color. This topic is also expanded upon by discussing how Black educators face discrimination and judgment. Black people and educators often are seen as loud, aggressive, and confrontational. Black educators especially face concerns from students, parents, and other educators about whether they will be impartial and overly critical of non Black students. The article concludes with information on some of the possible causes of these silences and how to remedy them. I wholeheartedly agree with this article. I frequently have seen situations play out on social media where when a white person says something that a Black person has been saying, the white person are seen as a leader. They are praised for using their white privilege to call it out, and just a plethora of things that fall under the white savior trope. I also see the backlash Black people face when calling out injustices. We are called angry, bitter, and using the race card. In these conversations, tone policing happens, which is just a tactic used to silence Black people. This definitely is an article that I agree with, and I have found the information extremely useful as a person myself, who constantly silence themselves in the classroom out of fear. So, now to my goals. The article helped me realize that the issue of science in the classroom is multifaceted. I plan to use this information presented in the article to help me understand why some students may be silent and to find ways to help students build confidence so they may feel safe expressing themselves in the classroom. I also loved one idea that Dr. Ladson-Billings presented in her research, and that was to provide multiple means of classroom interaction and teaching strategies to explore classroom silences. That is something that I plan to use in my classroom in the future. And that is it on my presentation on the Gloria Lansing-Billings reader. I'll close it out with one of my favorite quotes by Dr. Lansing-Billings, and it goes, "Culturally relevant teaching honors the student's sense of humanity and dignity. Their complete personhood is never doubted. Self-worth and self-concept is promoted in the very basic way by acknowledging the individual's worthiness to be a part of a supportive and loving group." And that's it. I'm signing out. My name is Kristen Conrad. Thank you and bye-bye.